Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. In the wake of the Italian Grand Prix, multiple teams bringing further upgrade to their car to potentially challenge Red Bull, and we're not just talking McLaren, Mercedes and Ferrari, with more parts in the works over the coming rounds to potentially put Max Verstappen in an even more tricky position. Yes, Mercedes want to get back to where they were a few rounds ago. Ferrari want to extend the massive progress they seemingly made at Monza, but does this hurt Lando if they take points off him, or does it hurt Max more if we get more of a Monza situation where the Red Bull comes the fourth fastest car in most of these Grand Prix? Could that feasibly happen? Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Yesterday we talked about this Flexiwing drama. It's always there or thereabouts here in the sport, and the FIA, as you might well have expected, basically said, we can't be bothered to look into it. So they say they will, or potentially may, introduce new tests for the flexibility of the bodywork. We talked about it in yesterday's video, how the McLaren, the Mercedes front wing is flexing under high speed and low speed more so than the other teams' cars or the other teams' front wings. And as a result, the Red Bull and Ferrari guys are basically saying, are we sure this is fair? Because if it is fair, we're going to do it as well. The FIA is saying, well, we have the right to introduce new tests, we're not going to do that in the short term. So basically saying Red Bull and Ferrari, go ahead and make this front wing. It's pretty interesting, to be fair, that Giuliano De Chessa says that the advantage of this flexible front wing is more than just drag. Obviously, if you're on the straight and you're under maximum aerodynamic load and you can have that front wing flex as far as possible, effectively out of the way, down into the ground to flatten itself as much as possible, you can reduce drag on the top speed. To be fair, we've seen McLaren and both Mercedes really increase some of their aero efficiency in a straight line over the last couple of seasons or so. But apparently in the corners, it can also stop the bouncing, just because these cars are so complicated. If you can allow your front wing to flex in a certain way, you can trigger a certain level of airflow to the floor, and therefore that prevents the bouncing because of, the way the floor interacts with the ground. It's a very complicated engineering challenge, but it does seem like this gives a rather substantial advantage. Now, if you slap a Red Bull version of this McLaren wing on their RB20, does it fix the car? No. They clearly have other issues, but maybe for Ferrari it's potentially even better, right? I mean, if Ferrari can do something kind of like this, that can give them, because their car works, Ferrari, right? It doesn't seem to have fundamental flaws. Yes, they brought an upgrade package a few rounds ago that did introduce some problems, but they seem to have been resolved on what we saw in Monza. We'll discuss that more in a second, because Monza is a pretty atypical track on the Formula 1 calendar. But nonetheless, maybe there's, something to be said for Ferrari on that side of things. Couple of interesting points as well. Théo Pourchaire would love a drive in Formula 1, obviously. I mean, why wouldn't you as a Formula 2 champion? He wants the Sauber seat. It's option. It's available, right? We think maybe Bottas gets it. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe Bortoletto gets it. Maybe he doesn't. But Pourchaire wants the chance. I will say this information from Colapinto's side does paint a rather promising picture of bringing rookies into the sport. I think we saw it it was kind of dubbed, I think maybe Joe Soud or somebody talked about it as the Behrman effect. What Behrman did in the Ferrari back in, obviously, the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. Very difficult track, super challenging circumstances, not even having the first day of practice, literally one practice session in qualifying for Ollie Behrman, had to go straight into it on one of the most difficult tracks in the entire world, and 11th in qualifying, 7th in the race, did a stellar job. And the feeling has been from other team principals that we can put rookies in our cars and they're well prepared enough from their junior Formula experiences to still do a respectable job. And apparently Colapinto, who had a solid race at Monza, 12th in the ends, with that result has actually already overtaken Valtteri Bottas in the standings, which is just goes to show you how poor Sauber have been this year. But apparently in the sim, he's within a 10th of Alex Albon already. Now, the sim is one thing, on track is another. What tracks are we talking about? Is it his best track, right? Or whatever the case is. But this says a couple of things, if this is true. Firstly, Logan was either just atrocious or just didn't work with that car for whatever reason. Clearly, Logan's a talented driver, right? More talented than all of us criticizing him. But at the same time, he wasn't working, and obviously this is justifying Val's decision to replace him if this turns out to be true. And to be fair, he had a solid race, didn't bid it, right? And that's probably good enough. And also, if Colapinto does well, then maybe that makes their decision for next year a little bit tricky. Not tricky per se, but what do you do with Colapinto if he has a really good close to the season, and then have got Sainz and Albon together? And I'm also a bit concerned for Albon if this is true, because if it's, the reality is that Colapinto's close to him already, I think Sainz might kind of destroy him next year. I think that's possible if this is the case. I don't necessarily know if this is fully the case. I do rate Albon a bit higher than Attons. You know, he did 36-0 destroy Logan Sargent over the last couple of years. And Sargent was known for his pretty good qualifying pace in Formula 2, for example. So this is interesting. There's a couple of things to say on that for sure. But let's talk about where these teams currently lie. Fair play to Max Verstappen, because he obviously had the most points over the first 8 rounds. Charles Leclerc was second. And over the most recent 8 rounds, Max Verstappen still has the most points. Mainly, that is McLaren bottling it, and at times Lando Norris. But Charles Leclerc is not too far away from this conversation. Outside of those couple of very difficult rounds at like Austria and Silverstone, outside of that, Leclerc has had a very good season, and he's obviously making a bit of a comeback now. If you look at the last 5 races, Charles Leclerc has scored 67 points. He's actually scored the most of anyone over the last 3 races. Lando scored 85. Oscar's scored 85 over the last 3. Hamilton scored 79. Gotta say, it's been an awful run of form for Russell, really. Not all his fault, obviously, what happened in Spa, but there have been a couple of races where either by his own doing or the team's doing, obviously Silverstone, the DNF didn't help either, right? So, there's a few things that have gone wrong for him, but nonetheless, scoring less points than Perez, or fewer points than Perez, as it should be grammatically correct, over the last 5 rounds is not a great sign, really. And Max is still here at 66, but Leclerc, Max has been outscored by 4 drivers over the last 5 rounds, which is pretty remarkable. And McLaren have just dominated everyone in the constructors over the last 5 rounds as well. That should really be no surprise. However, one other team wants to get themselves back in the mix, and that of course is Aston Martin. We're expecting confirmation before the Baku Grand Prix in Azerbaijan, or the Azerbaijan Grand Prix in Baku, that Adrian Newey will join Aston Martin, and this seems to be the plan for Lawrence Stroll to get his son, to become a World Drivers' Champion, right? On some level it might be maybe not a shame exactly, but people are going to say, wow, Aston are signing all the big guns, right? Newey seems to be coming in. They've obviously signed many other big names over the last few years, and that talent is designing a car for Lance Stroll, you know what I mean? But it is also designing a car for Fernando Alonso. The debate really is whether Newey to Ferrari wasn't a thing because Newey decided against it or because Ferrari decided against it. There's lots of criticism actually floating around social media around this announcement, which is apparently coming soon, on Newey, saying, wow, can't believe you turned down the chance to work with Ferrari, work with Lewis Hamilton, form another dream team with Charles Leclerc, whatever, and form, with Fred Vasseur, of course, French team principal. There's echoes, isn't there, of that Ferrari golden era with Schumacher, Todd, Brawn, etc., etc. But Newey either said no to that, or what seems to me to be the more likely one is that Ferrari declined interest, either because Newey wanted too much power, as was rumoured, or because they just didn't want to pay enough money. But I don't know if I buy that one, just because they were willing to give Hamilton the absolute world, all the money in the world he wants. So would they be stingy on Newey? Doubtful. I think it was probably other things, but it seems like Aston are going to pay him 100 million over 3 years or something. So that's pretty difficult to compete with, to be fair, and they have the money to do it. So the deal is supposedly done, and Newey will design Aston Martin's Formula 1 cars, especially in 2026. It makes a really exciting prospect, actually, because 2026, we've got Audi coming into play. They're not going to be trying to mess around. Red Bull is still going to be there. Mercedes is still going to be there. McLaren is still going to be there. Ferrari are never going away. And then you've got the prospect of even maybe Williams, right, putting full focus into that year. Aston Martin with the Honda engine still as a works team. Newey's coming on board. Alonso's still going to be there to drive the car. So, there's lots of excitement for that. And apparently this deal is going to be made public relatively soon. But let's talk about, of course, when discussing Newey, he departed Red Bull, and now their team's in an absolute freefall. Is that on Newey? Well, there's clearly a correlation there. Whether there's a causation, there's got to be something to do with it, hasn't it? You've got to think that there's at least some relevance, even if not necessarily in the fact that, he leaves and therefore they somehow lacking understanding the car's fallen off. There's at least a problem in terms of you can't ring him up and say, hey, how do we fix this? Because, he's left that Formula 1 project. Even as Max says, they're going to Baku, which has been good for them the last couple of years, sure. But, well, we'll talk about that in a second. And they're also going to Singapore, which has been Max's, it's the only track pretty much that he's not won at. He's had horrible, luck there, and maybe not even luck. I mean, the car's not performed, he's made mistakes, whatever the case is. He's not had a good time at Singapore, even with better machinery than this. And this year he's not got good machinery. So it's difficult to imagine that Verstappen and Red Bull are going to turn up to Singapore and have a banger weekend. That is, of course, another great opportunity for McLaren and Lando to put some serious points in the bag. But even as Max says, even at a normal track, we're not the fastest car, so at Singapore it's probably going to be an absolute disaster. And if you guys would have told me even a few months ago, certainly a year ago, that Liam Lawson was driving this year's Red Bull at Monza today, and the replies were going to be, have my thoughts and prayers, free him from the shackles, my condolences from having to drive that garbage truck, as this guy says, poor guy, thoughts and prayers, spoiler, he doesn't want to drive it again. So, it's a remarkable turn of events that's happened here at Red Bull, and even Marco says something that will concern Red Bull fans and, Verstappen fans, and probably, Verstappen himself, because Marco was talking during the Monza weekend, they'd understood something, the car was in a better spot, looked a bit better for quali, looked a bit better in race trim, obviously, and that they have upgrades in the pipeline to fix some of their problems. Then he says, we realised at Monza there is a massive fundamental problem with the car. We're working full speed to find a solution. And there is, a talk that, they've discovered what the problem is, as in you can look at the data and you can see the problem. Fixing the problem, though, is obviously a bit of a different story, and we've discussed over the last few weeks where this problem has emerged from. I talked about yesterday, right, the search for peak downforce and why that might have thrown them off to some degree. My feeling is that for a regression of this magnitude, there must be more than one thing going on. That's why we've talked about the asymmetric braking stuff. I was also just thinking about this morning. China was the Grand Prix where they had 8/10, a second a lap advantage over anyone in the entire field. And it was very shortly after that things went very south very quickly for the Red Bull team, to the point where they're now 6/10 behind the leader per lap on a track like Monza, and Max is finishing 37 seconds off the lead. It's remarkable, which is why I feel there might be multiple factors in play, but my thought was that of any circuit where asymmetric braking might help the most, you've got to think China's up there, right? I mean, that first corner, that incredibly long, windy, getting slower and slower right-hander, asymmetric braking will be all over that. So, I don't know, I just, I look at the situation, I think maybe there's something to that, but we're never probably going to know unless we get more talk about it coming soon. The reality is that whatever's gone on, there's massive problems with the car, and Max believes that the car is fundamentally broken. There's nothing they can do to solve it with setup. They just have to manage it, and Checo says that the car understeers and oversteers even in the same corner. So there's clearly massive problems, and they don't seem to be able to get it in a consistent working window anywhere near as well as any of the other top teams, let alone McLaren, who can do that seemingly effortlessly, basically anywhere they go. So big problems for them to solve. The circuit of the Americas, which is, to be fair, quite a while away, that is the Grand Prix where they will bring an upgrade. But the concern, I guess, for them would be that there's talk about correlation problems, not understanding what's happening in the sim compared to what's happening in reality for Red Bull. And we've also got to remember they have less testing time, less aerodynamic analysis time in the CFD and all this stuff, because they've been leading the championships for so long. That's now how it works. Circuit of the Americas at Austin, they will bring some upgrades. The problem is that going to solve the problem that they've now discovered in Monza? Probably not. And also, it's a while away, right? We've got Baku, we've got Singapore, then we've got another 3-week break in the Canada, then we go to Austin on, I think, the 20th of October, which is quite a while away for Red Bull to turn this whole thing around. The other very interesting piece, though, is that for Red Bull, it's not just McLaren they have to worry about. It's not like McLaren are getting 1-2s and Max is always third or Max is second or whatever, right? Max has, one podium in the last 4 races? Something like that? It's outrageous to think about. And even as Zach Brown says, the constructors is not over. Not because Red Bull are making a comeback, but because Ferrari are in the mix. And this is very interesting, right? Because it's absolutely not out of the realms of possibility here that Ferrari end the season in either winning the constructors or ahead of Red Bull. This is how it was last year. This is how it is this year. We have, once again, a big 4 at the top. Aston Martin, of course, have dropped off. But look, McLaren are right here with Red Bull now. Ferrari are right here with Red Bull now. Mercedes are probably a bit too far away to do any damage, really. But still, like, the fight is on. It's not over. Like, if you think about the gap between Red Bull and McLaren, the gap isn't much bigger between Ferrari and McLaren. And if, Ferrari fail to execute, the concern, I guess, for me will be that McLaren might think, well, because we've got this real big fight for the constructors on, let's not prioritise Lando in the drivers, which, I think that would be a mistake. As I said a couple of days ago, you don't get these opportunities very often to try and win a World Drivers' Championship, certainly not to try and do both. The fact that they seem to just be throwing it away for no good reason, that is, frustrating many at the moment. But as I said earlier, Leclerc has been the one scoring the most points over the last 3 rounds, and good news for Ferrari, their upgrades, have more in the pipeline, but also they seem to have worked. It was a big talking point, and I made it very clear before the Italian Grand Prix weekend in Monza, these upgrades had to work. There was no other outcome that was acceptable, because if those upgrades, that big package that Ferrari introduced, failed, then, their season was probably cooked. And also next season as well, massive concern if they can't solve those problems they created for themselves with the bouncing that we saw earlier in the season. It was much better in Monza. Then again, it's Monza. It's a track that isn't necessarily super typical. Ultra high speed, not too many corners that you'd expect to see too much bouncing induced, not too many kind of like, let's say, consistent, higher speed, kind of medium speed corners that the Ferrari seems to struggle with. I think the Parabolica is definitely one of those corners that Ferrari have had problems with, but it definitely seemed better this weekend. So they're happy about the upgrades, they're confident about their 2025 trajectory, and also they have more upgrades in the pipeline as well. So there's lots to be said on Ferrari's progress early. And to be honest, despite the fact that Charles Leclerc won, one of the happiest men finishing that Grand Prix will in some way have been Lewis Hamilton, right? Because he's definitely looking at that Ferrari thinking, okay, thankfully their upgrades worked and they're on a good path for next season when I'm going to be there. I think that Hamilton-Leclerc lineup, by the way, is going to be absolutely one of the greatest lineups ever assembled in the history of Formula One. Like, you guys know how highly I rate Charles Leclerc, and then, like, Lewis Hamilton needs no introduction either, right? So, there was some talk from Hamilton as well, though, on the fact that their own car has upgrades. It's interesting for Mercedes. After they won, as they did in Spa and in Silverstone, of course, they got lucky in Austria. The talk from the team was they didn't expect their car to be the fastest everywhere. They were, frankly, surprised it was fastest in Spa. I think there will be weekends from now to the end of the year where Mercedes either is the fastest car or they're winning a race again or whatever. But they're clearly just a bit of a step behind, even in terms of bringing their new floor in, affected their balance to some degree. They've got a bit of work to do on that. And Hamilton was happy enough with the car lately, but it's just not quite been quick enough, right? And Ferrari took a step, McLaren took a step. Going back to their spec in Silverstone and Spa isn't going to be good enough anymore. So they're going to need upgrades. He says, look, we do have small bits to bring. I don't know if we have anything huge coming, but, we've got some more parts is what he says. We definitely have updates coming. He doesn't know if that's going to be good enough to get to the front of the field again, but he does think it might be good enough to fight for another victory, which is really what he's going for, of course, at this point in the season, right? So, yeah, fascinating developments happening at the moment. Very much intrigued to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comment section below. Just to close out with here, I thought really was kind of interesting from Red Bull on the situation with Perez and with Verstappen. In some ways, kind of classic comments here from Marco, who says, Checo's not bad, he's just kind of slow. He's just slower than Max is. The priority is for Max to win the drivers. So it's interesting that a team member says, because this is why Marco's great on some level. He'll just say it how it is. Most teams will tell you, oh no, we're a team. The constructors is the most important championship, right? We want to win for all the men and women back at the factory and all this stuff. Marco will say, yeah, well, we just want Max to win the drivers, really. We're probably cooked to the constructors anyway because Checo's just slow. So it is what it is, and this is obviously, not necessarily Red Bull's public perspective, but it is most certainly Marco's perspective on the situation. But very much intrigued to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comment section below. These are your Aramco power rankings for the weekend, which are never the best, but I thought it was at least worth throwing it into the mix, and Connor Pinto gets on here as well. So very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.